we've obviously picked up some strands today around like how does the market look ahead of January 1? And I think the big question is, have the hurricanes that we've just seen, quite devastating ones, but the loss estimates are kind of moving all the time. Have they really changed the picture for pricing on property cat running into the kind of end of year negotiations? You know.
So I'm going to answer the question, but before I do, some pre-lunch levity. Mm-hmm. I plan to wear a suit and a tie to match Ian. And so I brought one down in Bermuda, took it out of my closet this morning. It was wrinkled, put it into the shower to steam it. Came back 10 minutes later, it was in a heap, in a puddle. So if I'm underdressed, I'm very sorry.
This is your segue talking about flooding. In the...
Flood, yeah. So there was a cat event in my hotel room this morning. Yeah, the impact of recent losses. So I think, without Helene and Milton, there would have been a very noticeable softening in the market. And so I think that those events sustained current pricing, but there's going to be some downward pressure. Mm. And so if we look at those events, the last I saw, if you take the middle of all the ranges, Helene's projected at about $8.5 billion. And if you look at the estimates for Milton, that's a little trickier because it's $33 billion without PCS, but PCS came out with a very low number of $5 billion. So with PCS, it's $27 billion. And so that, will come.
For those that don't know, PCS.
Property Claims Services, probably I know it's the most widely used index for insurance links for cat bonds when they are indexed, and for something called ILWs.
So that lower number is going to be critical to where the cat bonds pay out as opposed to.
It's going to be critical, and there's a bunch of retro and other forms of reinsurance that pay out based on the index, but it's just very far.
Why do you think we've seen that spread? Because as it was coming in, and obviously we were all reporting on it, it kind of moved at the last moment, and the spreads were massive in terms of the potential loss estimates.
So I was down here 2 weeks ago and met with a bunch of reinsurers, and at least half of every meeting was on this. Mm. And what I'm told is the storm broke up very dramatically upon hitting land, much more so than other storms. So it became pretty hard to estimate. And I was here on a Monday, PCS came out on a Friday, and there was sort of outrage among reinsurers because everyone wants to sort of index their losses and say, hey, we did better than the market, but the market level was set very low by PCS. But over the 3 days I was here, the estimates were coming down. And so I don't know if the original estimates will hold. Yeah. I suspect PCS will come up, and the rest of them will come down.
I suppose so the kind of first broader question is, given that the loss estimates have come down, is it really going to change the picture ahead of 1/1? Do you think as that kind of loss experience develops, it might be that we actually haven't had that bad a year for hurricanes overall, and that actually softening?
It hasn't been that bad. So I think total insured losses globally from cat events are around 140 billion, which is up from 120 or 125 last year. And that's not too far off modeled expected losses. Yeah. And so cat reinsurers are going to make money this year. And in fact, I haven't talked to anybody that's going to lose money in their cat portfolios. So that's a reasonable amount, maybe an expected amount of retained earnings. And last year was a record. The average cat balance sheet retained 30+%. And so when you talk about flows of capital into the industry, what usually gets missed is retained earnings.
Yeah.
So that's really an avalanche of capital. And now some of it's been dividended, some of it's being used in more aggressive asset plays, investment plays. So it's not all going back, but there's plenty of capacity. And so the only thing that's going to sustain pricing is the discipline of the reinsurers.
Yeah. That supply-demand dynamic of reinsurance capital is going to be really interesting this year for the reasons you give, right? It's like even though prices had risen significantly in recent years, we didn't see a lot of supply coming into the market. Has that changed now? You talked about retained earnings, but are we seeing new firms coming through as well to take?
So I haven't been around for a long time raising capital for new reinsurers. In this market cycle where pricing might be at an all-time best level, there's no private equity capital coming in to form new companies. Investors, private equity, just don't want rated balance sheets. The one exception might be Brian Dupero's company, Moderator, which I understand from him is going to get funded by the end of the year, but very different than past cycles. And the big reason for that is that investors didn't do well with those reinsurers in the past 2 cycles.
Investors not wanting to take the other side of the climate bet, all the things we've been talking about today, or?
Yeah, I was going to come back to that.
Yeah.
With one thing that I think will sustain pricing is the nature of Helene and Milton. They're sort of black swan events. So, Milton formed in and was in the Gulf of Mexico only, went west to east, blew up into a Cat 5, was the second strongest recorded hurricane ever in the Gulf. Now it went south of Tampa, it kind of died down, but it could have ended very differently. And so that gives management teams, especially boards of directors and investors, pause. And then Helene, was just as much of a black swan event. It was a hurricane that went through the mountains of North Carolina, so a hurricane strength wind, very odd. And so although total losses are about in line with what was expected, those couple of events will cause boards and investors and investor committees, and there's always somebody that will say, hey, you can't underrate the weather.
Yeah.
And that person will be validated after those events.
And it kind of added a bit more data to that question of whether global warming is making hurricanes worse. And obviously, in some quarters of the insurance sector, that's controversial, but many people say warmer ocean temperatures is just pretty...
We have all-time high ocean temperatures, and ocean temperatures fuel hurricanes, so I think it's hard to deny that. I know some do, but I think...
If you have a combination of what we were talking about earlier, secondary perils, fires and floods becoming more extreme, more severe and more frequent due to climate change, it's broad thinking, but then layered on the very big events like hurricanes also becoming potentially more potent. Is that what's adding up to the kind of investor unease or more capital? And so, do you think this kind of capital constrained environment that we're in will continue even if, or in terms of new capital, because you made the point of retained earnings, but do you think that will continue even if it's another kind of very profitable year for the reinsurers?
I think that's a cloud over the industry.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of sophisticated investors that just can't get comfortable taking risk on weather and cat events.
So the industry is still kind of earning back its reputation of it needs to have a few years of...
It does, and back to what's going to sustain pricing, and Jeff talked about it a couple of sessions ago. 2023 was a fantastic year for reinsurers. Some recorded record ROEs, but the 7 years or so leading up to that were horrific. Reinsurers either lost money or didn't cover their cost of capital. So after one very good year, one kind of expected year, it's hard to see reinsurers really dropping pricing. Tough to tell your board and investors that, oh yeah, we want to write more at a lower price. So the black swan, the odd events, probably on the back of provable global warming, and then just needing to earn back some of what was lost over 7 years, I think will keep pricing flat to down a little bit this year.
Yeah, and then just to round off what you remarks on cat bonds, do you think, mentioning that kind of loss estimate falling sharply, is there going to be kind of any dent to their reputation of cat bonds through this? If like traditional reinsurers pay out, cat bonds don't. Yeah.
I mean, cat bonds attach at a much higher level
anyway,
on average, and none of them. Now there's a NFIP bond that might be close, but no other cat bonds are close to being hit. So it's going to be a great year for cat bonds.
It's not going to lead to a reappraisal of whether.
No, and in fact, I mean, there's not a lot of data points, but the cat bond pricing peaked in June, and that's when the forecast from hell came out.
Yeah.
Projecting all the horrible storms, many horrible storms, and investors, the capacity that's closest to the investors reacts the most to those sorts of things. The traditional reinsurers are like, hey, no correlation between forecast and reality. it's viewed differently among investors. And so with that, cap on pricing peaked, and it's down about 20 or 25% right now. In fact, we're pricing a cap on next week, and we think it'll be down 25% from our desk quote in June. And so that's significant.
Yeah.
And when I said, hey, the traditional market will be flat to down some, I'm grossly simplifying. I mean, it's what layer, upper layers will be softer, lower layers won't be, loss effect.
You have to generalize.
Yeah, in 15 minutes.
I want to ask you about casualty quickly. We were talking about legal inflation earlier, or legal system abuse, as we were told we should refer to it. How is the industry kind of responding to that?
So legal abuse, is real. Call it what you want: nuclear verdicts, legal abuse, social inflation. There's just this attitude in the U.S. among most people to stick it to big corporations, stick it to the man. And unless there's real reform, the only thing insurance companies and reinsurers can do is to push on price and terms and conditions. And because of that, you're seeing a lot of the business flow into the E&S market, and it has traditionally, but it's not flowing back, and I don't think it will. And so you end up with very expensive, poor coverages because of the crappy legal system we have.
Yeah.
And so, one thing everybody in this room can do is talk to regulators and talk to politicians. We need reform.
Yeah. I mean, is it changing like the way insurers think about, whether to fight claims and your experience?
Yeah. So, one thing we've seen across the board is insurers and reinsurers putting down smaller limits, and the idea is that they want to diversify more. And if there's some, legal wrangling going on, they can toss their limit in. And so now I think there's two unintended consequences. One is writers of liability business, they're all sort of index writers. The deals are much broadly syndicated than they were, and so nobody really stands out. And then two,
what's the implication of that? That like price discovery is worse, or
it's just
finding a price risk?
Or you just there's no alpha in writing liability. It's all beta because everyone's writing the same little limits.
Leadership. That's back to our theme.
It's really no big limit writers like AIG used to be. The other consequence is that the payout patterns are rapid because everyone's throwing in their limit, they get paid out sooner, and you see this big spike in early payments. Now, no one really knows if the liabilities are worse or if people are just tossing in these little limits and it's going to level out.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see. Look, we've got 2 minutes left. Does anyone have a question for Rob? I know I haven't given you much time, but please. Yes, there's a question here at the front. Oh, there's a microphone coming to you just for the benefit of others. Here we go.
Thanks. You mentioned reforms. Can you go into that a bit?
Well, and one good example is the reforms in Florida, which targeted the homeowners business. And people were a little bit circumspect and not certain if they would work, and they've worked, I think, better than most people expected. And so, litigation funders, litigation funds have a lot to do with these nuclear verdicts. There's lots of money to pursue crazy lawsuits. And so I'm a capitalist, but I'm not sure if we should be funding lawsuits. I think it leads to really bad behavior.
Any other questions? Maybe be able to squeeze just one more in. Any takers going? Okay, well, just join me in thanking Rob for a really interesting discussion.
Thanks.
That was great.